Well, good afternoon. My name is Katrina Ingram, and I was told that we should be a little bit provocative in these workshops. And so this is a data workshop, but the title is Your Doorbell Racist? And I'm going to be talking about encoded bias in AI-enabled technology. We are going to be covering data. We're going to be covering a lot of things in the next 45 minutes. So I'm hoping to have a little bit of time at the end for questions, but if we do run out of time, I would encourage you to reach out to me. Definitely send me an email. I love to answer questions and have a dialogue with you, but I do have a lot of information that I want to share with you today. But before we get into all of that, I want to tell you a little bit about my own personal story into this work. I'm really excited to be here today talking with you because, like you, I am a professional communicator. I spent the bulk of my career in marketing and communication roles and a lot of time in media. So I was at the CBC for a little bit, but I spent many years at this place, CKUA Radio here in Edmonton. And I was at CKUA for about a decade. And it was in 2017 that I decided I love media, I love radio, but I want to try a couple of new things. And I wasn't sure where I wanted to go in terms of my career. And that led me on a path back to school to do a master's in communications and technology at the University of Alberta. And in undertaking that journey, I serendipitously landed in the world of artificial intelligence and ethics. And so I am not a technical person. I did not learn how to do machine learning, but I learned a lot about it in terms of what it meant for society. I learned a lot about the ethical considerations around artificial intelligence and the use of data. And that's really the crux of what I want to talk with you about today. And so to start out with, I'll just kind of touch on the things I hope to cover in this session. So I want to talk about the ethical issues in AI, the role of data. We're going to do a super quick tour of the history of AI. I think it's really important to understand kind of the backstory on this, if you will. And we'll also talk very briefly about what exactly is AI anyways. Then we'll have a discussion about how bias kind of gets encoded into these technologies and some examples of that. And finally, we'll end on what I hope to be a more positive note, which is how do we address these issues? What can we do as communicators in particular? So that's really what I want to cover with you today. But let's talk a bit about the headlines. Now, as professional communicators, I'm sure that you're up on some of what's going on in terms of the biases that can happen when it comes to artificial intelligence. You may have seen some of these scary headlines. Everything from monopolies that are happening when it comes to our data, such as Google kind of taking over our health record systems. And some of the things that are happening with deep fakes and misinformation, disinformation, and the role that AI and data play in all of that. I want to share a personal story. This happened to me just a month ago, and I'm consulting on an anti-Black racism podcast. And I wanted to throw up a very quick website to show my client just how we could display some of the information. And so I went to Weebly. They have a site where you can kind of build a free website very quickly. And so I went in there and I threw up some information. I was looking in the photo editor. I wanted a nice photograph. I wanted some Black people having a conversation just to put on this website. And so I searched for the term Black people. And I was using the photo editor, which is attached to Flickr, and it came up with all these horribly racist images, not even of people, but of just awful sayings and bad things. And I was just, on the one hand, as a researcher, I knew exactly what was going on. And I'm going to talk to you more about how this bias gets encoded into a data set. As a person, I was just, horrified and just kind of alarmed by what happened. And so it just sort of, hit me very deeply in that moment. And this is just literally a month ago. And so it's a fresh example. But let me dig into what exactly was going on in terms of this racist search. Before I get to that, though, let me talk a bit about another example. Joy Bualamwili is an AI researcher. And she did a landmark study called Gender Shades. And what was happening for Joy is that she was working on a degree, a master's degree at MIT, and she found that the facial recognition software that she was using for her project, it wasn't recognizing her face. And so she wound up having to code her project wearing a white mask. And what she demonstrated through her work is that the facial recognition technologies do not work well for all people. And in fact, women of color in particular were a segment where these technologies didn't work very well at all. And so there's a movie that was made about this called Coded Bias. It's excellent. It really goes into her story in a lot more detail and the landmark study that she did. So these are some of the issues that we find with respect to technology and how it can lead to ethical concerns, human rights issues. So we see things like privacy kind of weighing into the equation as we're collecting and using all of the data that's needed to power an AI system. We're seeing things like human rights challenges, whether things are accountable, whether they're transparent, there's issues of justice and equity. All of these kind of things are coming to bear when we look at what's going on with some of these systems. And when I think about this in the context of our work as communicators, reputational risk is one of the obvious things that comes up. And later on, I'm going to talk a bit more about this, but I just kind of wanted to flag that for you as we're having this discussion. So these are some foundational texts and go-to resources that I found very helpful in the course of my work. And I think that they really sum up nicely what's happening and the fact that technology is not neutral. And the first time I heard that statement, one of the first times was listening to Sophia Noble. She actually came to Edmonton in February of 2019 and did a talk about her book, Algorithms of Oppression. And what she talked about was exactly what happened to me with that Weebly search. So I was searching for a term, and what came back was a lot of racial and racist kind of encoded data. And this is what happened to Sophia Noble when she was doing her work for her book many, many years ago. She discovered that these search engines are not actually neutral or objective. And the first time I heard that, it was a little shocking because I thought, well, these technologies must be objective. They're computers. I mean, that's, you know, how could they have racism baked into them? But the reality is that they do. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about how that happens. The other book that, and person who I feel very aligned with in terms of her work is Ruha Benjamin, and she's a sociologist from Princeton and has written an excellent book called Race After Technology. And she has lots of great examples about how this happens and kind of the taking more of a sociological approach, as you might imagine, and kind of like looking at the systems that create these results. And so anyways, I wanted to share these resources as two foundational texts that have really informed a lot of my work. So in terms of my own work and how I think about and frame these issues and where we find ethical issues in the development of AI, I like to think about it in terms of three buckets: data, math, and people. And when I think about these, I think about concentric circles. And I kind of start in the middle with data because it's pretty concrete and we can kind of think about how data gets encoded with biases, how the history of how data was collected or who we paid attention to collect data from kind of leads us to have, you know, maybe a lot of data on one group and maybe not so much data on another group. So we have over or under representation that can kind of be in our data set. And so data kind of setting the ground truth or being what the systems use to learn from is a really important piece of the equation, but it's not the whole story. Kind of wrapped onto data, and the next concentric circle is math. And it might seem controversial to say math is not neutral. We think of, you know, 2 + 2, it's 4. How is this, you know, not objective? But what I mean by this is the computational models, the computational mathematical models that are used to construct AI systems have a lot of decision making that go into them. And these decisions are made by people. And so there's a thing called feature engineering, whereby you can dial up the volume on certain things, dial down the volume on other things. You get to make all these judgment calls of how you're going to weight things. And all of that has biases baked into it because it involves decisions made by people. And so this next concentric circle is actually the people. And when you think about the people who make AI systems, first of all, it's not a very diverse group of people. It's mostly men of a certain kind of background, socioeconomic status, PhDs, highly educated, and they're mostly white or Asian. Only 2% of Google's workforce is Black. Only 16 to 18% of AI researchers are women. So right away, we have a very homogenous and elite group of people who are making a lot of these decisions. So we layer that into a bigger socio-technical system in terms of how these decisions are being made. And what I mean by that is something like funding, for example. So how do we decide that something is worthwhile in terms of a problem worth putting resources behind? Somebody makes that decision. And right now, there are a handful of companies who are kind of leading the charge when it comes to AI on a global scale. They're the players that you would normally think about, the big players in the space. And they're making a lot of decisions about what kind of technologies come to light versus what don't. And so there's a lot of decisions being made, again, that have to do more with politics and economics and other things, not just the technology itself. And that's what I mean by the people layer. So those are some of the areas that I believe we find, ethical issues throughout the system.